There are families who build empires, and there are families who build something far more difficult to sustain: silence. The Hermès name appears on storefronts across 6 continents. It adorns the wrists and shoulders of those who measure wealth, not in figures, but in access. Yet for all its visibility, the family behind the name remains almost entirely obscured. No tell-all memoirs, no public feuds, no heirs photographed stumbling out of nightclubs. In a world where exposure is currency, the Hermès family has chosen a different economy altogether. If you find yourself drawn to these quieter histories, to the architecture of power, and the families who inhabit it, consider subscribing. We are approaching our first 1,000, and your presence here makes these investigations possible. Paris, autumn of 2010. The leaves along the Faubourg Saint-Honoré had begun to turn, and inside the Maison's headquarters, something unprecedented was unfolding. LVMH, the largest luxury conglomerate on earth, had quietly accumulated a stake in Hermès, a move that, in any other company, might have triggered celebration among shareholders. Here, it triggered war. The family had spent 6 generations perfecting the art of invisibility. They did not seek the press. They did not attend galas. They did not sell. And now, without warning, a predator had entered the gates. What followed was not a negotiation. It was a closing of ranks so swift, so total, that financial analysts struggled to explain it. Within months, more than 50 family members, descendants scattered across France and beyond, many of whom had never worked a day in the company, agreed to lock their shares into a holding structure that would make any future hostile takeover mathematically impossible. They called it H51. The name was deliberate: 51%, permanent majority. A fortress built not of stone, but of bloodlines. The world's financial press described the maneuver as unprecedented. But for those who understood the Hermès way, it was simply the latest iteration of a principle that had governed the family since 1837. Control is not a strategy. It is survival. To understand how such unity was possible, how a family of more than 60 shareholders, spread across multiple branches and generations, could act as one, requires looking backward. Not to the boutiques or the scarves or the handbags that now define the brand, but to a workshop on the outskirts of Paris, where a young saddler named Thierry Hermès first threaded a needle and made a promise to himself. He was born in Krefeld, a German town known for its silk and velvet trade, in 1801. By the time he arrived in Paris as a young man, he carried no inheritance, no connections, no reputation. What he carried was a skill, the ability to work leather with a precision that bordered on obsession. He opened his first atelier in 1837, not on the Grand Boulevards, but in the Grands Boulevards quarter, serving a clientele of coachmen and aristocrats who demanded harnesses and bridles of uncompromising quality. He did not advertise, he did not discount, he did not rush. And slowly, through decades of labor, his name became synonymous with a single idea: that craftsmanship, done properly, was its own form of authority. Thierry died in 1878, leaving behind a modest business and an immodest expectation that his descendants would continue not merely the work, but the philosophy. His son Charles-Émile expanded the workshop. His grandsons opened the flagship store on the Faubourg Saint-Honoré, where it remains to this day. Each generation inherited not just shares, but a burden. The understanding that Hermès was not theirs to transform, it was theirs to protect. And protect it they did. Through 2 world wars, through economic collapses, through the rise of mass production, which rendered their methods economically absurd. Other luxury houses sold to conglomerates. Others chased trends. Hermès refused. The family maintained majority control, decade after decade, not through aggression, but through a kind of disciplined stillness. But stillness, as anyone who has tried to hold something precious knows, is not the same as ease. By the late 20th century, the family had grown large. Cousins who had never met held equal claims to a legacy they experienced in vastly different ways. Some worked in the ateliers. Others pursued careers in medicine, law, academia. Yet all were bound by the same expectation: do not sell, do not speak, do not break the chain. How much control is necessary for a legacy to survive, and how much does it cost those who guard it? The answer, if it exists, lies not in the boardrooms or the boutiques. It lies in the silences between family members, in the dinners where certain topics are never raised, in the weight of a name that offers privilege and demands, in return, something closer to surrender. The story of Hermès is not a story of scandal. It is something more unsettling, a story of perfection, maintained at a price that no balance sheet can capture. And in 2010, when the outside world finally came knocking, the family had to decide what that price truly was. The workshop that Thierry Hermès opened in 1837 measured no more than a few dozen square meters. It smelled of leather and linseed oil, and the light that entered through its single window was never quite enough. He worked by candlelight more often than not, stitching harnesses for the carriages that rattled through Paris's cobblestone streets. There was no storefront, no sign bearing his name. Clients came by word of mouth, or they did not come at all. He was not building a brand, he was building a reputation. And in the Paris of Louis-Philippe, those were different things entirely. The city was transforming. The Industrial Revolution had begun reshaping the economy, and with it, the nature of luxury itself. Factories could now produce goods faster and cheaper than any artisan, but Thierry understood something that the factory owners did not. For a certain clientele, speed was not a virtue. These were men who owned dozens of horses, who employed coachmen and groomsmen, who measured status not by what they could acquire, but by what they could commission. For them, a harness was not a piece of equipment. It was a statement. Thierry gave them statements worth making. His stitching was invisible from the outside, a technique that required more time, but produced cleaner lines. His leather was selected by hand, each hide inspected for imperfections that most eyes would never notice. He refused to delegate the finishing work, and he charged accordingly. By the 1850s, his clientele included members of the French aristocracy and, reportedly, buyers from as far as Russia and North Africa. The workshop expanded. Apprentices were hired. But the methods remained unchanged. Thierry had established a principle that would outlast him. Hermès would grow only as fast as quality permitted, not a stitch faster. He died in 1878, the same year the Paris Exposition Universelle dazzled the world with visions of technological progress. His son, Charles-Émile, inherited a business that was profitable but modest, perhaps 40 employees, a loyal clientele, and a name that meant something only within a narrow circle. Charles-Émile could have sold. He could have licensed the name, as others were beginning to do. Instead, he made a decision that would define the next century. He moved the business to 24 Rue du Faubourg Saint-Honoré. The address was not chosen at random. The Faubourg was the artery of Parisian elegance, home to embassies, private mansions, and the kind of clientele that did not ask prices. Charles-Émile was not merely relocating a workshop. He was making a claim that Hermès belonged among the institutions of permanence. The new premises were modest by the street standards, but they allowed for something the old workshop never could, a retail space. For the first time, clients could enter, browse, and purchase directly. Charles-Émile expanded the product line beyond harnesses to include saddles, bridles, and eventually leather bags designed for riders to carry their equipment. The saddlery trade was evolving, and he evolved with it, but always within the boundaries his father had established. He also made another decision, quieter, but equally consequential. He brought his sons into the business young. Adolphe and Émile Maurice learned the trade not as heirs, but as apprentices, cutting leather and stitching seams alongside the workers. By the time they assumed control in the early 20th century, they understood the company not as an abstraction, but as a physical practice. The weight of a tool, the smell of a hide, the patience required to do some things properly. Émile Maurice, in particular, possessed a restless curiosity that would reshape Hermès entirely. He traveled widely, to Canada, to South America, to the racetracks of England, studying how other cultures worked leather and what they demanded from it. In 1900, he introduced the haute à courroie bag, designed to carry saddles and riding boots. It was large, impractical for daily use, and built to last decades. Clients adored it, but Émile Maurice saw something else on the horizon. The automobile was beginning to replace the horse. Carriage sales were declining. The saddlery trade, which had sustained the family for 3 generations, was becoming obsolete. A lesser businessman might have panicked. Émile Maurice adapted. He began developing leather goods for the new machines, driving gloves, luggage designed to fit in automobile trunks, accessories for a clientele that still demanded craftsmanship but no longer needed harnesses. The transition was gradual, almost invisible from the outside. But inside the family, it represented something profound. The understanding that survival required evolution, and evolution required letting go. By the 1920s, Hermès had become something more than a saddlery. It was a leather goods house, a luggage maker, and increasingly, a name associated with a lifestyle rather than a single product. Émile Maurice introduced silk scarves in 1937, exactly 1 century after his grandfather had opened the first workshop. The timing was deliberate. The message was clear. Hermès honored its past by refusing to be imprisoned by it. But evolution brought complications. The family was growing. Émile Maurice had 4 children, and they in turn would have children of their own. The business that had once been the work of a single man's hands was becoming a web of inheritances, expectations, and competing visions. How does a family hold something together when the thing itself keeps changing shape? Émile Maurice understood the danger. He began instituting practices that would later become doctrine, the expectation that family members work within the company before assuming leadership, the prohibition against selling shares outside the bloodline, the cultivation of discretion as a family value. He was not merely running a business, he was engineering a dynasty. Whether he succeeded would not be clear for decades. The war was coming, and with it, a test that no amount of stitching could prepare them for. The German occupation of Paris began in June 1940. Within weeks, the city that had defined European elegance became a study in controlled silence. Curfews emptied the boulevards. Rationing reduced the markets to shadows of their former abundance. And on the Faubourg Saint-Honoré, the great houses of luxury faced a question that no amount of craftsmanship could answer. How does one survive when the world that sustained you has ceased to exist? Hermès remained open. This fact alone requires examination. The occupation created a brutal economy of collaboration and resistance, with countless gradations between. Some businesses shuttered entirely, their owners fleeing south or abroad. Others adapted with enthusiasm, supplying the occupying forces and profiting from the new order. Hermès chose a narrower path, remaining operational, serving whoever entered the doors, but refusing to expand or actively court German clientele. The workshop continued producing leather goods, though materials grew scarce. The silk scarves, introduced just 3 years before the war, became unexpected currency, small enough to hide, valuable enough to trade, beautiful enough to remind their owners that elegance had not entirely vanished. According to some accounts, Hermès artisans developed new techniques during these years, precisely because traditional materials were unavailable. Necessity, as ever, proved a demanding teacher. Émile Maurice was in his 70s by then, and the daily management had begun passing to his son-in-law, Robert Dumas. The transition was neither smooth nor entirely willing. Émile Maurice had spent 5 decades shaping Hermès according to his vision, and relinquishing control did not come naturally. But the war made succession unavoidable. The old world was dying. Someone younger would need to navigate what came next. Robert Dumas was not a Hermès by blood, but he had married into the family and absorbed its values with the fervor of a convert. He understood that the war would end eventually, and that when it did, Hermès would need to be ready. He stockpiled materials when possible. He maintained relationships with suppliers. He kept the artisans employed, even when there was little for them to produce. The goal was not profit. The goal was continuity. Paris was liberated in August 1944. The celebrations that followed have been documented endlessly. The crowds, the flags, the tears of relief. What has been documented less is the quiet work that began the following morning, when shopkeepers and craftsmen surveyed what remained of their livelihoods and began the slow process of reconstruction. For Hermès, reconstruction meant more than repairing physical damage. It meant reclaiming a clientele that had been scattered by war, exile, and death. The aristocratic families who had once commissioned custom saddles were diminished, their estates divided, their fortunes depleted. The new wealth emerging in post-war Europe was different. Industrialists, film stars, Americans flush with dollars, and eager for the markers of old-world refinement. Robert Dumas recognized the shift and calibrated accordingly. He expanded the accessories line, introducing ties and belts alongside the traditional leather goods. He cultivated relationships with the fashion press, understanding that visibility, carefully managed, could replace the word-of-mouth networks that had sustained earlier generations. And in 1951, he registered a particular shade of orange as the official Hermès color, a choice that seemed minor at the time, but would become one of the most recognizable brand signatures in the world. The orange was not arbitrary. During the war, the company's traditional cream-colored boxes had become impossible to produce due to material shortages. Orange cardboard was available. Robert Dumas made a virtue of necessity, and the accident became identity. By the mid-1950s, Hermès had not merely survived the war. It had emerged positioned for an expansion that Thierry, stitching harnesses by candlelight a century before, could never have imagined. The flagship store on the Faubourg underwent renovation, its interiors redesigned to accommodate a clientele that now arrived by automobile rather than carriage. A second generation of Dumas children was coming of age, learning the trade as their elders had, through apprenticeship, not inheritance alone. But growth brought the question that had shadowed the family since Thierry's death. How do you expand without diluting? How do you welcome new clients without abandoning the old? How do you remain exclusive when exclusivity itself has become a selling point? Robert Dumas answered with a philosophy that would define Hermès for decades: scarcity as strategy. Production would increase only as fast as quality permitted. Waiting lists would be tolerated, even cultivated. The message to clients was unmistakable. Hermès did not need your business. You needed Hermès. It was an arrogant position. It was also, by every financial measure, correct. Demand consistently outpaced supply. Prices rose without resistance. The name accumulated a weight that transcended any individual product. Yet within the family, the mathematics of inheritance were becoming increasingly complex. Robert Dumas had children. Émile Maurice's other descendants had children. By the 1960s, the shareholder base had expanded to include cousins who barely knew one another, whose relationships to the company ranged from daily involvement to distant abstraction. The shares they held were not merely financial instruments. They were fragments of identity, proof of belonging to something larger than themselves. Selling was unthinkable, not because it was forbidden, but because it would mean surrendering a piece of who they were. How much of yourself must you sacrifice to remain part of something that defines you? The question was never asked aloud, but it hung over every family gathering, every shareholders' meeting, every decision about who would lead and who would follow. The silence that protected Hermès from the outside world also prevented the conversations that might have eased the tensions within. And tensions, left unspoken, do not disappear. They accumulate. The 1970s belonged to Jean-Louis Dumas. Robert's son had grown up inside the maison, absorbing its rhythms before he understood its balance sheets. He had worked in the workshops, learning to cut leather with the same precision his great-great-grandfather had demanded. He had studied the clients, observing what they reached for and what they left behind. And when he assumed creative direction in 1978, he carried not just authority, but intuition. The ability to sense what Hermès could become without betraying what it had always been. Under his leadership, the company entered what historians would later call its golden era. Revenue grew steadily, then dramatically. The client base expanded across continents, Tokyo, New York, Hong Kong, while the waiting lists grew longer rather than shorter. Jean-Louis understood something that eluded many of his competitors. In luxury, abundance is the enemy. The moment a product becomes easily available, it ceases to be desired. He applied this principle with surgical precision. Production quotas remained fixed regardless of demand. New stores opened slowly, each location selected with the care others reserved for choosing a spouse. Advertising was minimal and deliberately oblique. Images of scarves, of leather, of horses, but rarely of prices or availability. The message was consistent. Hermès exists. Whether you can access it is another matter entirely. The Birkin bag emerged from this philosophy. The story has been told so often, it has acquired the polish of myth. A chance encounter on an airplane in 1984 between Jean-Louis Dumas and the actress Jane Birkin. A conversation about the impracticality of her existing handbag. A sketch on an air sickness bag. Whether the details are precise matters less than what followed. The bag that bore her name became, within a decade, the most coveted accessory in the world. Not because it was advertised, because it was withheld. A single Birkin required approximately 18 hours of labor from a single artisan. The leather was selected from hides that met specifications so exacting that most were rejected. The hardware was plated, polished, and inspected by hand. The stitching used a technique called saddle stitching, in which two needles pass through the same hole from opposite directions, creating a seam that would not unravel, even if one thread broke. The method was inefficient by any industrial standard. That was precisely the point. Prices began at several $1,000s and climbed into six figures for rare leathers and custom configurations. Waiting lists stretched to years. Secondary markets emerged where bags sold for multiples of their retail price. Economists studied the phenomenon. Sociologists wrote papers. And through it all, Hermès maintained its silence, neither confirming demand figures nor acknowledging the frenzy. The scarcity spoke for itself. By the 1990s, the Maison employed over 3,000 artisans across multiple ateliers in France. The flagship on the Faubourg Saint-Honoré had expanded to occupy adjacent buildings, its interiors a labyrinth of rooms dedicated to leather, silk, jewelry, and fragrance. Annual revenues approached €1 billion. The family's collective fortune, distributed across dozens of shareholders, placed them among the wealthiest dynasties in Europe. Yet wealth of this magnitude creates its own gravitational field. Cousins who had once gathered for holidays now met primarily in boardrooms. Shareholders who had never touched a piece of leather held voting rights equal to those who spent their lives in the ateliers. The company that Thierry had built with his hands had become an abstraction. Numbers on a statement, percentages in a portfolio. Jean-Louis worked to maintain cohesion. He instituted family councils, regular gatherings designed to keep the branches connected. He emphasized the company's history, commissioning books and exhibitions that reminded shareholders of their shared inheritance. He promoted from within the family whenever possible, ensuring that Dumas and Hermès names appeared throughout the organizational chart. But promotion breeds resentment when not everyone can be promoted, and inheritance breeds entitlement when the inherited thing is valuable enough. The tensions remained beneath the surface, invisible to the outside world. Hermès continued to project an image of seamless elegance. The orange boxes, the silk scarves, the artisans bent over their work with monastic concentration. The press wrote admiring profiles. Competitors studied the model and failed to replicate it. The family's unity appeared unshakable. Appearances, however, are a specialty of the luxury trade. Inside the shareholders' meetings, debates grew sharper. Some branches wanted faster expansion, more accessibility, a loosening of the production constraints that limited revenue. Others insisted on the traditional model, arguing that any compromise would erode the very scarcity that sustained demand. The arguments were conducted in measured tones, with the politeness that old money learns as a survival skill. But politeness is not agreement, and disagreement, compounded over years, becomes something harder to contain. Jean-Louis navigated these currents with a diplomat's patience. He conceded on minor points to preserve consensus on major ones. He cultivated relationships with individual family members, understanding that loyalty was built through attention rather than authority. He aged in the role, his hair whitening, his movements slowing, his grip on the company's direction remaining firm even as his energy diminished. What he could not control was the world beyond the family. The luxury sector was consolidating. Conglomerates like LVMH and Kering were acquiring heritage brands with the appetite of empires, absorbing competitors and integrating them into vast portfolios. The logic was simple. Scale created leverage. Leverage created margins. Margins created power. Independent houses were becoming anachronisms, holdouts in an industry that increasingly rewarded size over tradition. Hermès watched these consolidations with studied detachment. The family had no intention of selling. The family had never sold. But intention means little when the buyer is determined enough and the stakes are high enough. How long can a fortress hold when the siege is patient? Jean-Louis Dumas would not live to answer that question. But the answer was already approaching, disguised in the language of investment and shareholder value, moving quietly through the markets while the family focused on its craft. Jean-Louis Dumas stepped down as chairman in 2006, his health failing after years of what would later be identified as a degenerative neurological condition. The transition had been prepared for years. His successor, Patrick Thomas, was not a family member, but a professional manager who had earned the family's trust through decades of service. It was an unusual choice for a dynasty that had always kept leadership within the bloodline. But Jean-Louis understood that the challenges ahead required a different kind of expertise. Patrick Thomas inherited a company at the peak of its commercial success. Annual revenues had surpassed 2 billion euros. The brand's recognition was global. Waiting lists for Birkin bags had become a cultural phenomenon, referenced in films and television shows, studied in business schools as case studies in demand management. By every external measure, Hermès had achieved what most family businesses never approach: relevance across generations, growth without dilution, tradition without stagnation. Inside the ateliers, the rhythm continued as it had for decades. In Pantin, on the outskirts of Paris, Leather workers arrived each morning to workshops flooded with northern light. They worked at individual stations, each artisan responsible for a single bag, from start to finish. There were no assembly lines, no division of labor in the industrial sense. A craftsman who began a Kelly bag would complete that Kelly bag, signing the interior with a personal stamp that identified the work as theirs. The training required years. New artisans spent months simply learning to handle leather, understanding how different hides responded to moisture, to heat, to the pressure of a needle. They practiced stitching on scraps until their seams met the company's standards, which were not published but passed down through demonstration and correction. Only after this apprenticeship could they begin working on actual products, and even then, under supervision. The process was inefficient by design. A factory using modern methods could produce dozens of bags in the time it took a single Hermès artisan to complete one. But efficiency was never the point. The point was the object itself, its weight, its smell, its capacity to age with its owner rather than against them. Clients who purchased Hermès leather goods understood they were buying time as much as material, time measured not in hours of labor, but in years of accumulated knowledge. This philosophy extended beyond the workshops. The company maintained its own tanneries, its own silk printing facilities, its own network of suppliers, bound by contracts, that prioritized consistency over cost. Vertical integration was not a business strategy, but an article of faith, the belief that control over every stage of production was the only guarantee of quality. Yet control has its limits. The markets do not respect tradition. And in the years following Jean-Louis's departure, the markets began moving in directions that no amount of craftsmanship could influence. The 2008 financial crisis struck the luxury sector with unexpected force. Demand contracted. Stock prices fell. Companies that had seemed invincible discovered their vulnerabilities. Hermès weathered the storm better than most. Its client base skewed toward the ultra-wealthy, who remained insulated from the worst effects. But the crisis revealed something that had been easy to ignore during the years of expansion. The company's share price, depressed by the broader collapse, made it a target. Bernard Arnault had been watching for years. The chairman of LVMH had built his empire through acquisition, purchasing heritage brands and integrating them into a portfolio that generated synergies invisible to the individual houses. He had approached Hermès before, indirectly, through intermediaries who suggested partnerships or collaborations. The family had declined. They had always declined, but declining an offer is different from preventing a purchase. And in the open market, shares can be acquired without permission. The mechanism Arnault used was elegant in its complexity. Through a series of equity swaps, financial instruments that allowed LVMH to accumulate economic exposure to Hermès shares without triggering disclosure requirements, his company quietly built a position that reached nearly 15% by October 2010. When the stake was finally revealed, the family learned of it not through negotiation, but through public announcement. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Patrick Thomas described the move as an attack. Family members who had not spoken in years found themselves aligned in opposition. The language of business gave way to the language of violation, the sense that something sacred had been breached. What made the incursion particularly threatening was its patience. Arnault did not need majority control to influence the company. A significant minority stake, combined with the fragmentation inherent in any large family, could be leveraged over time. Dissenting shareholders might be cultivated. Generational transitions might create opportunities. The fortress that had held for 6 generations suddenly seemed less impregnable. The family convened in meetings that stretched across weeks. Branches that had disagreed on expansion strategies, on dividend policies, on questions of leadership, discovered that these disagreements meant nothing compared to the shared imperative of survival. The threat from outside clarified what years of internal debate had obscured. Whatever their differences, they were Hermès. And Hermès did not surrender. The solution they devised was unprecedented in French corporate history. More than 50 family members agreed to pool their shares into a holding company called H51, structured to ensure that no individual could sell without the consent of the group. The arrangement locked approximately 51% of outstanding shares, enough to guarantee permanent majority control for a minimum of 20 years. The cost of this unity was significant. Shareholders who entered the pact surrendered liquidity, the ability to convert their inheritance into cash when needed. They accepted constraints on their financial freedom in exchange for collective security. The decision was not made lightly. Some family members held reservations, but the vote, when it came, was unanimous. How much must you give up to protect what you have inherited? The question had followed the Hermès family for generations. In the autumn of 2010, they answered it with a commitment that bound not just themselves, but their children and their children's children. The fortress would hold, the silence would continue, and the price would be paid by those who came after. The legal battle that followed the H51 announcement stretched across years. Hermès filed a complaint with French market regulators, alleging that LVMH's use of equity swaps had violated disclosure rules designed to ensure transparency in share accumulation. The accusation was serious: market manipulation, conducted through instruments specifically chosen to evade regulatory oversight. LVMH denied wrongdoing, arguing that its methods were legal under existing frameworks, however aggressive they might appear. The proceedings moved through French courts, with the deliberation characteristic of complex financial litigation. Testimony was gathered. Documents were subpoenaed. Experts debated the technical definitions of disclosure thresholds and the intent behind transactions executed across multiple jurisdictions. For a family that had spent generations cultivating invisibility, the exposure was excruciating. Internal communications became evidence. Strategic discussions became public record. The silence that had protected Hermès was, for the first time, forcibly breached. In 2013, French regulators ruled against LVMH, imposing a fine of 8 million euros, substantial in principle, negligible against the conglomerate's revenues. More significantly, the ruling validated the family's position. The acquisition had been conducted in a manner designed to circumvent the rules. Moral victory, if not material triumph. But Bernard Arnault had achieved something that no fine could reverse. LVMH retained its stake, eventually reaching approximately 23% of Hermès shares. The family controlled the company. The conglomerate controlled the conversation. Every quarterly report, every strategic announcement, every leadership transition now occurred under the scrutiny of a shareholder whose interests did not align with the family's and whose patience was legendary. Jean-Louis Dumas did not witness the resolution of the conflict he had spent his final years anticipating. He died in May 2010, just months before the LVMH stake became public. The timing carried a cruel symmetry. The man who had guided Hermès through its greatest expansion departed just as its greatest threat materialized. Those who knew him suggested the stress of his final years had accelerated his decline. Others maintained that he had seen the danger coming and had done what he could to prepare the family. The truth, as with most things concerning the Dumas clan, remained private. His funeral was held without public announcement. The family gathered, mourned, and returned to work. There were no interviews, no retrospectives authorized for publication, no moment of collective reflection shared with the world. Jean-Louis had lived by the principle that Hermès spoke through its objects, not its owners. In death, as in life, he was afforded the silence he had cultivated. The company he left behind faced challenges that craftsmanship alone could not resolve. The H51 Pact had secured control, but it had also crystallized divisions that might otherwise have remained fluid. Family members who had entered the holding structure discovered that their shares, though valuable on paper, had become effectively illiquid. They could not sell without collective consent. They could not borrow against holdings that lacked a clear market. They were wealthy in a way that resembled obligation more than freedom. For some, this was acceptable, the price of belonging to something larger than themselves. For others, particularly among the younger generation, it raised questions that their elders preferred not to address. What did it mean to inherit shares you could not sell in a company you might never lead, bound by agreements you had not negotiated? The family councils that Jean-Louis had instituted continued, but the conversations within them grew more strained. Attendance became irregular. Enthusiasm waned. The ateliers, meanwhile, operated as they always had. Artisans arrived each morning, selected their leather, threaded their needles. The Birkin bags emerged one by one, each carrying the stamp of its maker. Silk scarves were printed in lion, using methods that had not fundamentally changed in half a century. The orange boxes were folded, filled, and dispatched to clients whose names appeared on waiting lists years long. From the outside, nothing had changed. But the family that owned this machinery was no longer the family it had been. The branches had multiplied across generations until the connections between them became attenuated, maintained more by legal structure than by affection. Cousins who shared great-great-grandparents shared little else. Their lives had diverged, different cities, different careers, different relationships to the name they carried. What united them was not history, but obligation, the weight of signatures on documents that bound them to one another, whether they wished it or not. Axel Dumas assumed the role of executive chairman in 2013, continuing the family's tradition of internal succession. He was Jean-Louis's nephew, raised within the company's orbit, trained in its methods. His appointment signaled continuity, the reassurance that Hermès would remain Hermès, guided by blood rather than hired expertise. Patrick Thomas, the professional manager who had navigated the LVMH crisis, stepped aside with the grace expected of someone who had always understood his role as temporary. Axel inherited not just a company, but a contradiction. The market rewarded growth, but growth required production increases that the family's philosophy prohibited. Competitors expanded into new categories, new geographies, new price points. Hermès maintained its discipline, its scarcity, its insistence that demand would always exceed supply. The strategy remained profitable. Whether it remained sustainable was a question that each quarterly report answered only provisionally. The share price climbed regardless. Investors who could not understand the family's methods could understand the returns. By the late 2010s, Hermès had become one of the most valuable luxury companies in the world, its market capitalization exceeding that of conglomerates with far larger revenues. The valuation reflected not just current performance, but the expectation that the brand's mystique would endure indefinitely, that the silence would hold, that the craftsmanship would continue, that the family would remain united against whatever pressures emerged. Expectations, however, are not guarantees, and the pressures were mounting in ways that financial statements could not capture. The younger shareholders, those born in the 1980s and 1990s, who had come of age in a world where Hermès was already an institution rather than a family project, faced a particular burden. They had not chosen this inheritance. They had not built what they now owned, yet they were expected to protect it with the same ferocity as those who had stitched the first harnesses, who had survived the wars, who had fought off the predators. How long can obligation substitute for devotion? The family did not discuss such questions publicly. The family did not discuss much publicly at all. But within the councils, within the private gatherings that outsiders never witnessed, the weight of legacy pressed against the limits of what any single generation could bear. The fortress held. The silence continued. And somewhere, in a workshop on the outskirts of Paris, an artisan threaded a needle and began another bag, unaware of the pressures that made such simple work possible. Paris today. The flagship store at 24 Rue du Faubourg Saint-Honoré opens each morning at 10:30, its doors admitting a stream of clients who have traveled from every continent to stand where Thierry Hermès once cut leather by hand. The orange awnings catch the light. The windows display scarves arranged with the precision of museum installations. Inside, sales associates speak in measured tones, guiding visitors through rooms that smell faintly of leather and history. The waiting lists remain. A client seeking a Birkin bag in a particular leather, a particular color, may wait years before receiving the call that their order is ready. The scarcity that Jean-Louis Dumas cultivated has become self-sustaining, a mythology that requires no advertising, only the continued discipline of refusal. The family persists. More than 60 shareholders now hold pieces of the company their ancestor founded, their stakes locked within the H51 structure until at least 2031. They gather periodically, bound by legal obligation, and something harder to name. Some work within the maison. Others pursue lives entirely separate from leather and silk. All carry the weight of a name that opens doors and closes options in equal measure. LVMH remains a shareholder, its 23% stake a permanent reminder that the siege never truly ended, only paused. Bernard Arnault, now in his 70s, has never publicly abandoned his interest in Hermès. The family watches, the family waits, the fortress holds, but fortresses require vigilance, and vigilance extracts its own toll. In the ateliers at Pantin, the rhythm continues. Artisans bend over their stations, needles moving through leather with the patience their predecessors practiced a century ago. Each bag emerges slowly, deliberately, carrying the signature of its maker. The methods have not changed because the family has not permitted them to change. Whether this constitutes wisdom or stubbornness depends on whom you ask, and the family is not interested in answering. The question that has followed them since Thierry first threaded a needle remains unanswered, perhaps unanswerable. How much control is necessary for a legacy to survive? And how much does it cost those who guard it? The Hermès family has paid in liquidity, in freedom, in the conversations they cannot have and the choices they cannot make. They have paid in the weight of expectation, passed from generation to generation, growing heavier with each transfer. Perhaps this is what legacy truly means, not the objects that survive, but the sacrifices that make survival possible. The silence is not emptiness. It is the sound of a family holding something together through sheer collective will, year after year, generation after generation, until holding becomes indistinguishable from identity itself. The workshop closes each evening, as it has for nearly 2 centuries. The tools are cleaned, the leather is stored. The lights dim over stations where tomorrow another artisan will begin another bag, continuing a tradition that exists only because someone, long ago, decided it was worth protecting. Whether the protection is worth the cost is not for outsiders to judge. The family has made their choice. They continue making it every day in silence. If this story has stayed with you, consider leaving a like and subscribing to join us as we uncover the hidden histories behind the world's most enigmatic estates. Share in the comments which mansion or dynasty you would like to explore next. Thank you for watching, for listening, and for honoring these stories with your attention. Some legacies deserve witnesses. You have been one of them.